Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our history talk. My name is Carson. I'm the museum assistant and educator for the Lacey Museum. Before we begin tonight's presentation, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The Lacey Museum is on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Southern Lushootseed speakers in Nisqually and Squaxin Island. We acknowledge and remember not to forget those tribal people that are named but not recognized today, and were absorbed into tribes for survival or were relocated. We recognize the ancestors and their relations that are still here. Lacey and the South Puget Sound region are encompassed by the Treaty of Medicine Creek, signed under duress in 1854. We respect and affirm tribal sovereignty, and as part of the city of Lacey, we work with the Nisqually and Squaxin Island tribes in a government-to-government partnership. Thank you again all for joining us tonight. Tonight we will be hearing from author Steve Olson on his presentation entitled Mount St Helens at 42, The Anatomy of a Disaster. But before we begin Steve's presentation, I would like to share some museum news and updates with everyone. Maybe, if my computer wants to share. There it goes. I would like to share first that our museum is open. We are open Thursdays and Fridays from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. and Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. So if you're interested in coming to learn more about Lacey history, make sure you stop on by. Either myself or one of our amazing volunteers would be more than happy to give you a tour of either our Lacey exhibit or some of our traveling exhibits. And you'll want to make sure you stop by in June because we are having a new exhibit that's coming in June. The exhibit is called 1968, the year that rocked Washington. And this exhibit is brought to us by Legacy Washington. This exhibit looks at the year 1968 and its impact on Washington state through stories of some remarkable people that have lived through it. On college campuses, the evergreen peaks, the campaign trails, Washingtonians were spurred to action. And above all, 1968 showed the power of the individual to make a difference. So this is going to be a really fun and exciting exhibit. So make sure you stop by. We are going to have it up hopefully by the beginning of June, and it should be up for all of summer. So make sure you stop by the museum to see that. Also, I'd like to share that we do have a new museum website. It has launched a few weeks ago, but if you haven't been to one of our history talks, you may not have seen it. This is our new museum website. We have some great information found there, including upcoming events, some helpful research tools, and much more. So make sure you check it out. And you're going to want to make sure you check our website for this summer because we have some exciting summer programming happening at the museum. We're going to have things like a virtual cemetery tour at the Pioneer Cemetery. We are going to have a Sasquatch themed scavenger hunt, and we're going to have a few other really fun, family-friendly programs and events. So make sure you keep checking the laceymuseum.org for the most up-to-date information. And all of these programs will be happening during the summer, and they are for guests of all ages. Also coming up to share some additional events we have, the Lacey Depot and Playground Grand Opening event is going to be held on May 25th at 5:30 p.m. And also the Lacey Spring Fun Fair will be May 21st and May 22nd, and is a family event and it is free. So make sure you guys mark your calendars so you don't miss either of these events. Also, I would like to share that tonight is going to be our last history talk for the 2021-2022 season, which just means we're going to be taking a short hiatus for the summer, and then we're going to come back with our 2022-2023 season in September. So don't worry, the history talks aren't going away. We're just taking a short break for the summer, but we will come back. Our website is going to have the most up-to-date information about the new presentations, as well as we'll send out newsletters as well. So continue to check our website for all of those programs. Also, we will be sending out a survey soon about our history talks. We hope that you will all take a few moments to fill out the survey. Audience evaluations like this are essential for our efforts to improve our history talks, and we'd love to hear from all of you. So if you have any suggestions or anything, please feel free to fill out the survey. It should be coming out in about a week or so. And I believe those were all of my museum announcements I have for you guys. So I want to just share a little bit about how we're going to be handling our Q&A section. If you guys are new to our History Talk presentations, we tend to hold a question and answer section. It tends to be very lively in our history talks. So if you have any questions that arise, you're more than welcome to click that Q&A button that's located on your screen. It's usually located on the bottom bar. So if you don't see it, just kind of wiggle your mouse towards the bottom of your screen and it'll be a big Q&A button. If you have questions that you would like to ask live, just say, I would like to share this question myself as you type in the question. And when we get to the Q&A section, we can actually unmute you so you can ask your own question. If you do not want to ask the question or don't want to speak on the call, that's really fine. Just make sure you note that on your question as well. Or if you have any stories you'd like to share on this topic, just note that you'd like to share something and we can unmute you as well at the end of the presentation. All right, I think those are all the updates for the Q&A. So it is my honor to introduce tonight's wonderful speaker, Steve Olson. Steve Olson is the author of the most recently, The Apocalypse Factory, Plutonium and the Making of the Atomic Age, A New History of the Nuclear Era, told from the perspective of the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. His previous book, Eruption, The Untold Story of Mount St. Helens, won the Washington State Book Award and was named one of the best nonfiction books in 2016 by Amazon. He is also the author of Mapping Human History, Genes, Race, and Our Common Origins, which was nominated for the National Book Award, and other books. He has also written for The Atlantic Monthly, Science, The Smithsonian, and many other magazines. Since 1979, he has been a consultant writer for the National Academy of Sciences, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, and other scientific organizations. A native of Washington, he now lives in Seattle. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Steve.
Thank you, Carson. It's great to be here. And it's especially fun for me to talk to an audience that's at least partly from Lacey, because there's a major branch of my family that lives in Lacey. If you know any Olsons, it's O-L-S-O-N. I don't know quite how that spelling got onto my screen name, but in any event,
sorry about that.
oh well, it could very well have been some other process. But yeah, if you know an Olson in Lacey, it's probably related to me through my grandpa Olson. And I know that those Olsons, as well as everybody who lived in Washington State in 1980, has a Mount St. Helens story. And I thought I would begin by telling you mine, sort of to prime the pump for maybe some stories that we'll hear later on when we start sharing some of those stories. So I grew up in Othello, and that's actually why my most recent book, is about the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, which is just over those hills in the distance from Othello. You can see my house from this photograph. I never did climb the water tower as the more daring people in my class did, but this is the town that I grew up in. But I grew up in Othello in the 1960s and 1970s. And in the 1970s, I went east for college, where I met the woman that I would eventually marry. And so my Mount St. Helens story is that at the time when Mount St. Helens blew, and this was being covered extensively, I was living in Washington, D.C. at that time. My wife and I were getting ready to get married 3 weeks later. So we got married in Rhode Island at her family's house. Here's our wedding picture here from 42 years ago. Whenever the anniversary of the eruption approaches, I know that I need to start getting organized for my anniversary. And many of my relatives still lived in Eastern Washington, and they came back east to Rhode Island for this marriage. And many of them brought jars of ash that they had scraped off of their driveways in Eastern Washington because they got covered by so much ash, as conversation starters with these the new set of relatives that they were. And as I say in the book, I always figured that it was a good thing that I was living on the East Coast in 1980, because I was exactly the kind of kid that if I'd been living in Washington State, my suspicion is that I would have been very interested in what was going on at Mount St. Helens. If you remember the chronology from 1980, or you've read about it, if you weren't alive at that time, the mountain started acting up in about at the end of March of the year 1980, and pretty soon these small, they appeared big in retrospect, but in retrospect they don't appear that big compared to the eruption that was to follow. But these small eruptions of ash started occurring before the big eruption of May 18th, 1980. And if I'd been living in Washington State, my suspicion is that I would have gone down. I would have probably grabbed my brother and I would have said, come on, let's go see that volcano. And we would have gone to the volcano and gotten just as close as we could without being in the danger zones so that we could see if one of these eruptions was going to occur. And if I had done that on this weekend of May 17th and 18th, remember the eruption was a Sunday, May 18th, I don't think I'd be here to tell that story because I would have set up in exactly the place where the other people were watching the volcano on the morning of May 18th. So my wife actually got a job back in Seattle and we moved back to Washington State. I moved back to Washington State. She'd never lived here before. She was from Connecticut in the year 2009. And at that point, as Carson said, I'd written some books and I decided when I moved back to Washington State that I should write some books about this state because as a kid, especially as a kid in Eastern Washington, you really don't appreciate what you have when you have it. And I grew up in such a small town and was so desperate to get away that I think I didn't realize what an amazing state that we live in and how many great stories there were. So of course, I looked around for stories, and of course, the best story that the most amazing thing that had ever happened in Washington State was the eruption of Mount St. Helens. So I said to myself, well, I could write a book about Mount St. Helens, but of course, other books had been written about Mount St. Helens. If you go to a library, there are plenty of them. So I went to the library and I grabbed all those books and started reading them. And I found that most of those books were sort of about the geology of the mountain or the grandeur of volcanoes. But what I was interested in were those 57 people who had been killed during the eruption. I asked myself, why were these people so close to this dangerous volcano? Because in some cases, people were just 3 miles away. I said, were they inside the danger zones so that they were essentially breaking the law in their efforts to see the volcanoes? Was the eruption that much bigger than geologists anticipated? That was part of it. I mean, what was the story behind what happened to the people in this on that day of May 18th? I'll talk a little bit about Harry Truman, the one person who's remembered most from that day. What I discovered, and I'll tell you the story of this shortly, is that of the 57 people that were killed that day, only 3 were inside the danger zones, one of whom was Harry Truman, and the other 2 had permission to be there. It just so happens that the one person inside the danger zone is the person that is still remembered most from the eruption of Mount St. Helens. But what I discovered is that the story of those 57 people and what happened to them that day and why they were around the mountain was related to all these other amazing things in Washington State. It was related to the story of logging. I was very interested in the Weyerhaeuser family and the Weyerhaeuser company. This is the biggest tree that the Weyerhaeuser company ever cut down, just to the northwest of Mount St. Helens. And it was connected to the railroads. It was connected to the conservation movements in Washington State. I could just, by telling the story of what happened that day on May 18th, I could tell this very broad and I think just fascinating story about how the history of what had happened in Washington State over the course of the previous century and a half had a direct influence on the events of that Sunday, May 18th of 1980. So that's the story I tell in the first half of this book. And at that point, the volcano erupts, and I tell the story of some of the people around that volcano. So this is where the story starts, in the town of Rock Island, Illinois, which is about 150 miles west of Chicago on the Mississippi River. It's at this place in the Mississippi River where the river sort of swings out toward the west, and there's an island out here in the middle of the river, and that island was connected by the very first railroads. So that it was a sort of a gateway to the Western United States from Chicago. And in the year 1856, this man moved to Rock Island. This is Frederick Weyerhauser. He was an immigrant from Germany. He moved to the United States when he was 16 years old. He had just an 8th grade education. He went to work in Rock Island he worked for a brewer for a while. He worked on the railroad as a surveyor. But he eventually got a job in a lumber yard right on the edges of the river. In fact, you can kind of see that lumber yard here. All along this river is the lumber yard in which Weyerhaeuser went to work. He went to work as the night fireman, the person who keeps an eye on the boilers to make sure that they continue to operate over the course of the night. Well, a few years after he went to work for this lumber yard, the lumber yard went broke, and he and his brother put together everything that they had and purchased that bankrupt lumber yard and began to operate it themselves. So Weyerhaeuser was a man without much formal education, but he was an incredible businessman. He was just smart. He could sort of figure out problems. He could take them apart and put them together. He was extremely friendly with both customers and with his partners, and he had many partners up and down the Mississippi River. And he quickly began to build this lumber yard and make it into a going concern. And what he did at first is he bought timber cut down by other companies that were then brought down the Mississippi River by steamships like this, and put them in his lumber yard and sold the lumber. They would go over the train trestle, and you can see in the background here, and to the west. It was just a perfect time to own a lumber yard. It was around the time and right after the time of the Civil War. The United States was expanding into the west, into treeless areas, which really needed a lot of wood, both for structures and especially railroad ties. Railroad ties were one of the main things that were being provided by these lumber yards out to the western United States. But Weyerhaeuser in the 19th century was one of the first people to realize that the way to really make money at this business was to set up sort of, we would call it a vertically oriented operation at this point. He realized that if he could buy land upstream in the Mississippi River, or stumpage, the right to cut down trees on that land, he could then control the operation sort of from its source to the eventual sale of that timber. And so he gradually started buying more and more land up on the Mississippi River, and this lumber yard grew. By the 1880s or so, this was the largest and best known lumber yard on all of the Mississippi River, and Weyerhaeuser was just a name that was known throughout the Midwest. But then in the year 1891, what had happened is that Weyerhaeuser had cut down over the course of the several decades many of the trees that were directly north of Rock Island, Illinois, and the base of his operations really started to move to Minnesota. And so in the year 1891, he moved to St. Paul, Minnesota, and he moved in next door to this man, Jim Hill, the railroad baron who built the Great Northern Railway essentially from St. Paul to Seattle. Jim Hill is another amazing story. There's a lot of Northwest history that's very closely related to Jim Hill. There's a gigantic statue of him at the University of Washington, for instance. He built the rail line that comes over Stevens Pass. So far before, many decades before there was a highway over Stevens Pass, that rail line was there, which was built by Jim Hill. Another immigrant from Canada, another person with just an 8th grade education, but also an incredible businessman. This is the mansion in which Jim Hill lived in St. Paul, and you have to make reservations to go see it. But if you ever are going to St. Paul, actually, I'm going to St. Paul in about a month, and my wife has never seen this mansion, so I really should make some reservations. It's on Summit Avenue, where many prominent people in St. Paul have lived. I think Garrison Keillor might have a house either right next to or very close to this mansion. Anyway, Frederick Weyerhauser bought the mansion right next to Jim Hill's mansion. And because they were so similar in outlook and success, they got to be tremendous friends right away. They used to spend evenings at each other's houses all the time and discuss business and pleasure. Their families got to be friends. They were sort of the leading St. Paul businessmen of the time. So about 9 years after Weyerhaeuser moved there, Jim Hill had this problem. He wanted to buy the rail line that went to Burlington, Iowa. I always wondered about the Burlington Northern, because the only Burlington I knew was in Vermont. I always said, why was the Burlington Northern, which is a Western railroad, have anything to do with Vermont? But it isn't. That Burlington is from Burlington, Iowa. And Jim Hill wanted to buy it to add to his growing railroad empire. But he didn't have enough money to buy it. But what he had was an incredible number of trees. And here's why. Jim Hill, by that time, by the year 1900, had come to control not only the Great Northern, But the Northern Pacific Railroad, which, as you can see here, follows a very similar line from Minneapolis to ultimately Spokane, Pasco, Portland. It then they went on a ferry actually across the river and came up to Tacoma from the town of Kalama. The Northern Pacific was a land grant railroad, so this was a legislative proposal, legislative act in the 1900s, in the 1800s rather, in which Congress said to these railroad companies, if you will build a railroad to the Western United States across these very sparsely populated states and territories, we will give you every other section of land extending out 20 miles from the rail lines in the states and extending out 40 miles from the rail lines in the territories. So here's a diagram of, these are the current railroads in Washington State. And the old Northern Pacific line came down from Spokane to Portland, went up here across the river in Kalama. And the original line, which was built in 1873, extends from Kalama up to Tacoma. It's basically the route that I-5 takes today. If you see those rail lines there, those rail lines right next to I-5, in some cases in the middle of I-5, were built way before I-5. I mean, before automobiles were even considered a possible way of getting people around. So in exchange for building the rail line that extends up from Tacoma, essentially from Portland to Tacoma, the Northern Pacific was given every other section of land extending out 40 miles, because Washington was a territory, on either side of that rail line. So in the year 1900, January 3rd, 1900, so 3 days into the new century, Frederick Weyerhauser and Jim Hill, his next door neighbor, announced the biggest real estate deal that I think had ever occurred, private real estate deal that had ever occurred at that point in US history. Weyerhauser and his associates bought 900,000 acres of timber from Jim Hill for, oh gosh, I can't remember the number right now, but I think it's $6 an acre they bought that land. Here's a diagram that shows the land that Weyerhauser owns today. And much of this land is based on those old land grants. Weyerhauser would buy every other section of land, and they would start filling in the various sections along the rail lines. And that's how Weyerhauser came to control essentially all of the land between I-5 and the rail line and Mount St. Helens. Mount St. Helens is about 35 miles away. So he was buying all of the heavily timbered land between Mount St. Helens and I-5. Of course, he wasn't interested in the top of Mount St. Helens, so he didn't buy that. And that's why when the volcano erupted in 1980, the top of the mountain was still owned by the railroad. The mountain that got blasted all over the United States Weyerhauser was not interested in buying that. Okay, so that's sort of the situation that brings us up to the year 1980 and explains why it is that when you're driving up the Spirit Lake Highway, you see all the Weyerhauser signs. It's because Frederick Weyerhauser moved next door to Jim Hill in St. Paul, Minnesota in the 19th century. So here we are on March 20th, 1980. And on that day, toward the end of March, this earthquake occurred under Mount St. Helens. And it evidently was quite a jolt. I mean, people in the area definitely felt it. It was a 4.2, so that's enough to shake people pretty well. Now, you know, in the Pacific Northwest, we get these earthquakes and you'll just get a jolt and it'll subside, or maybe you'll get a couple of aftershocks. But in the case of this earthquake, it was followed by an increasing number and increasing intensity of earthquakes. Each one of these squiggles is an earthquake. See, if the diagram down there says from March 21st to March 23rd. Essentially, these earthquakes were just running together on the seismometers, so the geologists knew, as a result of this, that magma must be moving around underneath Mount St. Helens, because this is the only thing that would create a continuous series of earthquakes like this. Then, about a week later, after the first earthquake, this little crater opened up on the top of Mount St. Helens. There was a big boom when there were clouds over it. And somebody flew up there in this plane to take a look at this little crater. And not long after that, these, as I say, at the time, they seemed like major eruptions, but In retrospect, they were kind of small, steam-driven, what are called phreatic eruptions began to occur on Mount St. Helens from that crater and from other craters that opened up subsequently. So I was living in Washington, D.C. at this time, and there were stories about Mount St. Helens that were running all the time in the New York Times and the Washington Post. I mean, this was a big story. There had not been an eruption of a Cascades volcano since the eruption of Lassen Peak in Northern California in 1915, I think that was. And you know, that was in such an isolated part of the country that very few people were able to see it. So the reawakening of Mount St. Helens in March of 1980 just generated immense interest. And people came to Mount St. Helens from all over the United States, really. I mean, all over the world, people were coming to Mount St. Helens to see if they could see one of these small eruptions. So state and local officials had a problem. They did not want people to be able to get up close to the volcano because they were worried that they would get stuck in one of these eruptions. So the first thing they did is they started closing the roads. They would put road closures on the various roads that led up to Mount St. Helens. Although, you know, it's kind of a funny thing about these roadblocks, they had a tendency to move up and down like the Spirit Lake Highway and some of the other roads to Mount St. Helens, because people who own property or business just on the other side of the roadblock would say, oh, come on, you can certainly move that roadblock up the road a little bit so that I can get access to my property. And the state and local officials would accede to their wishes and move the roadblocks. And then the geologists would say, no, the roadblocks are getting way too close. I mean, these roadblocks were sort of in continuous movement in March and April of 1980. But, you know, after a while, the roadblocks really didn't matter all that much, because people started getting to the volcano in another way. By that time, in March of 1980, Weyerhaeuser had been logging the land between I-5 and Mount St. Helens for 80 years. And there were thousands of miles of these little logging roads. You can see them in this photograph. This is an amazing photograph for the purposes of my book. It kind of inspired a lot of the writing that I did, because a lot of what happens in my book takes place just right in this within the confines of this photograph. You can see all these little mining roads right here. So what people would do is they would turn off the I-5 and go up the Spirit Lake Highway a little tiny bit. Then they would turn off onto these logging roads and come up logging roads and set up on these ridges up around Mount St. Helens. And they've had photographic equipment. They'd see if they could get a picture of one of these eruptions. We'll see some people later on who were doing that. You'll also notice that at that time, Weyerhaeuser was logging the forests just to the west of Mount St. Helens. This was just happened to be the time when Weyerhaeuser was taking down the last of the old growth forests around Mount St. Helens. What they wanted to do was take down those big trees, you know, 3, 4 or more feet across, put them through the mills that could handle that old growth timber, and then become what they've become since then, basically a tree growing company, in which they would shut down the old growth mills. They would just grow trees, harvest them at much younger ages when they're much smaller, and be able to put them through other mills and make their profit that way. But in the spring of 1980, hundreds of Weyerhaeuser loggers were working in this area around Mount St. Helens every weekday, and that would have a big influence on the way that the story turned out. So local officials, state and local officials, needed another way to control access to the mountain. And so what they did is they set up some zones and to control access to areas around the mountain. And the first thing they did is they set up this thing called the red zone. They drew a line across that first ridge to the north of Mount St. Helens, this one right here. And they said, as I said in a subsequent lawsuit after the volcano erupted, they figured nothing would get over that ridge. So down that ridge, they drew a line, and then they sort of followed the ridge line around the north and to the east of Mount St. Helens. They were a little less worried on the southern side of the mountain. And so here, this just follows a road that you can still use to access Mount St. Helens. So anyway, they called this area the red zone. And into the red zone, only scientists and law enforcement officials could go. Everyone else was barred from this red zone. But there was an issue about this red zone, which is that Weyerhaeuser, remember I showed you, was logging this whole area just to the west of the mountain, and they didn't want to keep the loggers from from getting to their jobs. And so here on the northwest side of the mountain, the red zone, which at this point is just like 3 miles away from the volcano, so it's very close. The red zone just followed the line between Weyerhaeuser property that Weyerhaeuser had bought and the Forest Service property that was still left over. You can still see this is the boundary right here between these areas, between these Weyerhaeuser clear cuts in those areas. Now, they also set up a second area called the blue zone. It's shown by this dotted line in this map. The blue zone extends out farther from the volcano. Into this area, people could go if they signed a waiver saying that they wouldn't hold anybody responsible for things that might happen to them in this zone. But you'll see here on the northwest side of the volcano, the state and local officials did not want to force Weyerhaeuser workers, the hundreds of Weyerhaeuser workers who were working in this area during the week, to have to go through that legal rigmarole. So here there sort of is no blue zone. The blue zone just follows the red zone in this line that's about, at its closest, about 3 miles away from the volcano. Then in April, for people who remember the story, you might remember that something very strange happened. The side of the mountain started to bulge out. So geologists called this thing the bulge. There was something inside the volcano that was pressing on the interior of the volcano and causing this area of, I think I have another picture. Yeah, here's another picture of the bulge. This whole thing, at times this thing was growing at 5 feet per day, was extending out from the volcano. Here's a geologist shielding his instrument from the sun, measuring the size of the bulge. He's about 4 or 5 miles away, well, maybe even closer. Maybe this is the old timberline parking lot. So, he was very close to this bulge. Geologists at that time did not have a very good sense of how these bulges might behave. There were geologists who warned in the weeks before the big eruption that if this thing gave way, it would cause an avalanche that would extend all the way down to Spirit Lake and clearly kill this geologist and where he was. But there were lots of ideas about what might happen. They thought, well, maybe the bulge will come down in pieces, or maybe it'll subside a little bit. I mean, no one had a very good handle on exactly what was going to happen to this. Okay, so that brings us up to the weekend of May 17th and May 18th. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe for you the various people who spent the night of Saturday, May 17th, to the northwest of the volcano. That's what I decided to do in my book. I would look at all the people to the northwest of the volcano and not people elsewhere and sort of try to tell their stories, because these were the people who were sort of closest to the volcano. And one thing you'll notice, I'm hoping it happens this year actually, is that in Washington State, I don't know if our weather has been so strange this year, but it's often the case that in May, around the middle of May, you have an extended period of really nice weather around like the 15th, 16th, 17th, or 18th. We'll see if it happens this year. And in the year 1980, that exact same thing happened. So about midweek, before the weekend of the 17th and 18th, the weather forecast came out, and it had been another really, really rainy year. So maybe we will have a good May 17th and 18th. And the forecast was for warm temperatures and clear skies. So a lot of these people who were at the volcano Saturday night were not there to see the volcano. They were just there camping because they'd been cooped up all spring long and they wanted to get out to the volcano. I'll tell you about a little bit of that as we go along. Okay, so here's Harry Truman. As you can see, he's in his lodge on the shores of Spirit Lake. In this picture, it looks like the volcano's fairly far away, but actually it's only about 3 or 4 miles from this point. It's just the way that the lens makes the volcano look much closer. Harry Truman famously refused to leave the red zone, he said a lot of different things, but one thing he said was, if that volcano goes, then I'm going to go with it. I've lived here long enough, and that's my choice. It was actually quite a problem for law enforcement because other people would say they wanted to get access to their properties in this area. Police would say no, and they'd say, well, what about Harry Truman? He's up there. So So that was an issue for the police force. Bob Kesswitter and Beverly Weatherald were there was a group of about 80 cabins in an old homestead area down here about 1.5 miles down the Toutle River from Spirit Lake. And of course, it was in the red zone. People had to be evacuated from that area. But Bob and Beverly had convinced law enforcement that they were doing this photographic study from their porch of the volcano. I mean, a lot of people thought that was just kind of an excuse to get access to their cabin. But nevertheless, they were there that Saturday night and presumably took a couple of photographs. David Johnson, who, if there's a name you remember besides Harry Truman from the eruption of Mount St. Helens, you might remember David Johnson's name. He was on that first ridge line to the north of Mount St. Helens. Here he is in one of the Weyerhaeuser clear cuts, keeping an eye on the volcano. I think I have a picture, well, not quite here yet, but I will in a second, of what the volcano looks like from there. He'd actually never been to this site before Saturday, but he was filling in for a colleague who had to go to California. And he knew this was a dangerous spot to be in, but said, no, if it's just for one night, I'll go there. Reid Blackburn, photographer for the Columbian, the paper in Vancouver, Washington, also doing a photographic study of the mountain, also for the National Geographic. He's about 7 miles away from the volcano, which is just to the south of this picture right here. So you can't quite see the peak of the volcano here. John Killian and Christy Killian. Here's a sketch of John that my daughter did, a sketch of Christy, newlyweds from the town of Vader. I write quite a bit about Vader in my book. As you can see, and they were camping at Fawn Lake. I'll show you the place where they were camping. Right here at the outlet of Fawn Lake. See, you can't even see, Mount St. Helens is behind this ridge. You can't even see the mountain from where they were camping. But again, it was such a beautiful weekend, they just decided that they wanted to get away and go up to here to Fawn Lake. Okay, so all these people here are camping in the Green River Valley, a valley about 10 to 12 miles north of the volcano. Again, they're just here that Saturday night. This is 6 kids from Longview and Kelso who went up there, and we're just sort of having a barbecue in the woods. I'll tell you a little bit more about the Moors later on. These are 3, a dad and his 2 sons who managed to get away from the volcano. A couple guys from Tacoma who had ridden their horses down the Green River that Saturday, and then were camped right on the Green River not too long from there. So here we are. It's Saturday. This is the afternoon. You can see it's just this incredibly beautiful day. This is where Dave Johnson was sitting, looking across to the volcano. He's about 5 miles away from it. You can see it's covered with ash from these small eruptions that had been occurring for the 8 weeks before this. Here's the bulge, looking right at Dave Johnson. Okay, so Sunday morning. There's lots of amazing stories about Mount St. Helens and lots of amazing coincidences. One is that the people who took this photograph were a geologist and his wife who'd gone to a gem show in Yakima, and they had never seen the volcano, despite both being geologists, and they rented a little Cessna and a pilot and went up Sunday morning to look at the volcano. And they were flying over the volcano when what they said they saw was this crack that emerged in the volcano, and the whole north flank, this area where the bulge was, but much bigger than the bulge, just fell away. And this immense cloud, as soon as the north flank fell away, this immense cloud just burst from the volcano. Geologists dispute this name, but they sort of have a tendency to call this thing the blast. This is the blast from the volcano. So what happened is that avalanche headed, as predicted, down towards Spirit Lake. But before the avalanche, before the collapsing side of the north flank of the volcano could reach Spirit Lake, the blast overtook it and hit those cabins where the Weatheralds were and where Harry Truman was, and just blasted them to smithereens. And then a few seconds later, the avalanche came and covered them up. I mean, there's nothing left of those cabins, essentially. This blast was moving at hundreds of miles per hour. And so there was no possible way for them to escape. And it took maybe 30 seconds after this blast, they hit where Harry Truman was. Here's a picture someone who took from the east side of the volcano who managed to get away. And, I've always sort of imagined that this is what it looked like to David Johnson up on that ridgeline as he saw the volcano, as he saw the blast coming toward him. He had about 45 seconds before the blast reached him. And and got on the radio and said, Vancouver, this is it. He was doing his job. He was reporting on what was happening with the volcano. But when that blast hit Johnston Ridge, which you can go visit today if you go to the visitor center, it just scoured everything off the top of that ridge. It took those old growth trees that are there, just snapped them off. It took the David Johnson and the little, not a mobile home, but a little trailer that was up there, swept it all into the next valley and covered it with debris. I mean, of the 57 people killed in Mount St. Helens, the bodies of only about half were ever found. The other half were never found. And David Johnson was among those. Further away from the blast, this is Reid Blackburn's car. Remember, I told you he was the photographer who was about 7 miles to the northwest of the volcano. This is what happened to a lot of people at a greater distance from the volcano. As they tried to get away, the ash cloud overtook them. And the ash cloud, in the case of Reid Blackburn, just filled his car. He would start to breathe. There's no oxygen in the air. You're just breathing ash. Essentially, you drowned on the ash. You die of asphyxiation and the burns from this incredibly hot ash that was coming into that the blast was propagating to the northwest of the volcano. Here's Fawn Lake, where the Killians were camped. They were camped right here at the outlet to Fawn Lake. So see here, you can see Mount St. Helens. This is about 9 miles or so away from the volcano. Here's a little boat on the lake, just as a sense of scale. I mean, this is old growth timber that was knocked down by the blast. You get a sense of just the incredible force. I describe it in the book as sort of like a stone hurricane, winds traveling hundreds of miles an hour that are essentially solid. I mean, it was an immense thing. This is something that I show here in Seattle. These are the different zones of the volcano. The debris flow, that's sort of the avalanche that came down. Here's the volcano right here. The avalanche came as the north flank collapsed, went over to Spirit Lake here, went down the Toutle River. Here's the pyroclastic and mud flows as the glaciers on the mountain melted. The water runoff on the backside of the volcano, on the south side of the volcano, caused a variety of floods, although there weren't any fatalities back here, oddly. But what really caused fatalities were in this area called the blowdown zone. This is where the blast emerged to the north and northwest of the volcano, and this is a huge area. This is superimposed on a map of Seattle showing that all of Seattle essentially would be destroyed if the volcano were down here in like Seward Park. This distance right here is at 17 miles. The blowdown zone is the area in which the blast was strong enough to knock down trees. There was a guy fishing out here on the Green River, 17 miles away from the volcano, whose body was never found. That's how powerful the blast was and how great the devastation was in this very distant place from the volcano. So I'm going to finish up here in just a few minutes by telling you very quickly about all those people camped on the Green River. Remember, the 2 guys from Tacoma were here, right here in the Green River. Neither of them survived, although one almost did, came extremely close to getting away from the volcano. I told you I'd tell you about the Moors, who were camped sort of right at the base of this mountain right here. And these are not pictures that are in the book, but Mike Moore gave me permission to show some of them in this talk. They were camped in this amazing old growth forest, just gigantic trees, which is still there. The amazing thing about the Moors is that they essentially camped in the shadow they were camped right here. And there's a big mountain right here called Black Mountain, and that essentially shielded them in this area from the force of the blast, which is why these gigantic trees that they were camping in did not fall down. So that Sunday morning, Mike, who's a good photographer, heard the sound from the south and said, gosh, that must be Mount St. Helens. He ran out to this clear spot and started taking these photographs. And he said to himself, but we're 12 miles away from this volcano. We really don't need to worry about it. But as he watched this cloud approach, it just got closer and closer. And if you go to the visitor center, the Dave Johnson Visitor Center, you can read more about his descriptions of this cloud as approach. Just churning inside and full of lightning and colors. He said it was just an incredibly beautiful thing. But this cloud did overtake the Moors and their 2 daughters. And so what they did is they just happened to be camping right next to this little shack, an elk hunter shack. And they grabbed their tent and all their stuff and got inside this shack. And they were inside that shack for 2 hours as this ash cloud overtook them. And they said it was completely pitch black. Nobody could see anything. But they also said, and they never saw a flash of lightning, but they said that the thunder from the lightning was so loud that for 2 hours, they couldn't even talk to themselves, couldn't even talk to each other. It was just continuous. And so of thunder, not muffled by this ash at all, which is maybe an indication of how close the lightning was. But 2 hours later, the ash cloud did move away, and Mike and Bonnie, his daughter, 4-year-old daughter, came out and realized that they looked around. The ash, luckily, was not terribly hot right where they were. They realized they were going to have to camp and get out of this situation. So they loaded up their backpacks and started walking back down the trail that they had taken to get to this campground. And for a while, they're just in the regular forest, going through the trees, and then they come around a corner and see that the entire forest between them and their car has blown down. And there's like almost no way to get over this forest. These are gigantic old growth trees. And by this time, it's pretty late on Sunday afternoon. So they realize that they're just going to have to spend another night in the woods. So they set up their tent, they had extra food and water, and they said they slept pretty good that night, and got up on Monday morning and were ready to head out. But Monday morning, as they were trying to make their way over these trees, these helicopters were flying overhead and looking for survivors of the eruption. And Mike's wife, Lou, had worn this orange fleece, and the helicopter pilots said that they were able to see it in the trees and above the gray ash. They lowered a pararescue jumper on a cable who helped the Moors, but they weren't able to bring the Moors up to the helicopter for a variety of reasons. So they called in a very small helicopter to rescue the Moors. And the helicopter, a very famous helicopter pilot, a guy named Jess Hagerman, I don't tell this story in the book either, but he managed to get this little small helicopter set down, actually sort of hovering over an island, a gravel bar in the Green River, and the Moors start climbing the border. Mike gets on, and Bonnie gets on, and Lou gets on. Lou has a backpack. And the helicopter pilot is going, you can't bring that backpack on because we're way overloaded. There's no possible way that I'm going to be able to take off with if you just bring your gear onto the helicopter. Well, the Moors had another daughter who was only 6 months old. I can't remember, 4 months or 6 months old, and she was in the baby backpack. So she was in the backpack. So poor Bonnie or poor Lou is screaming at Jess. He really can't hear, and there's all this chaos going on. She's screaming, "There's a baby in it!" And finally, the helicopter pilot hears and says, "Okay, keep the baby." So they managed to get all the Moors on there and get away. This was the rescue of the Moors was sort of like the last rescue story of the eruption of Mount St. Helens. So here I think is my last slide, and then maybe we can talk a little bit, showing the areas of the 57, where the 57 people who were killed in the eruption were situated. As I said, it's only Harry Truman and the 2 people at their cabin on the Toutle River are the only people who are inside the danger zones. Everybody else was outside the danger zones and essentially killed in landslides and the blast and the various floods that occurred. And so that's what was so interesting to me about this book, was the fact that someone could move in next door to a railroad baron in the 19th century, and it would have a direct impact on the lives of all these people more than 80 years later. So anyway, those are my slides. I think Carson was going to maybe handle some questions, or maybe get some people online if they want to tell their Mount St. Helens stories, and I'd love to hear them if so.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Steve. That was so fascinating. I honestly didn't know as many of those stories, and so it's been so interesting to learn more about it. To our audience out there, if you guys have any questions for Steve, please feel free to go ahead and share those in the question and answer section. It should be located at the button on the bottom of your screen. If you would like to share your question, just say "I would like to share" as you type it. If you don't like, or if you don't want to share, like to speak in the presentation, that's absolutely fine. You can either leave it blank and I will share it, or just say "I don't want to talk," and that's really fine. I can ask the question. And Steve, while we're waiting for some of those questions to come in, I just wanted to ask, you were mentioning in the presentation how they had that like big earthquake in March, and then there were lots of little earthquakes, kind of seismic activity Were the geologists expecting there to be as big of a eruption as there was with Mount St. Helens?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. And it was discussed extensively by the geologists in the weeks leading up to the big eruption. And opinions varied. The geologists didn't really know what to expect. They didn't have a lot of experience with cascade volcanoes at that point, so they didn't really know exactly how they were going to behave. And the field of volcanology was a lot less advanced than it is today, in large part because of all the studies that have been done about St. Helens. So there were some geologists who did not anticipate a large eruption, or if they did anticipate eruption, they sort of thought, well, it'll be a conventional eruption in which it'll go straight up and the surrounding area won't be affected. But there were a couple of people, including David Johnson for that matter, who knew about volcanoes that had behaved very differently in other parts of the world, where the sides of the volcanoes had collapsed and clearly a whole area next to the volcano had been devastated. And they issued some warnings in the time before the big eruption that something like that could occur with Mount St. Helens. But it was sort of one of these classic low probability, high consequence events. And science and society both have a lot of problems figuring out how to deal with those things that are not likely to happen, but that could have a big impact if they do happen. So ultimately, that's one of the lessons of Mount St. Helens, is that we have to take those low possibility events seriously so that we can anticipate that in our planning. And I think volcanologists have tried to do that ever since.
Thank you. We have some questions coming in. First, Stephanie Morris just says, terrific program. So I always like to share that with our speakers.
Oh, great. Thank you.
And then we have one, they'd prefer not to speak. But Patrick asks, what do the latest studies say about when Mount St. Helens may erupt again?
Oh, yeah. And also an interesting question. Mount St. Helens is the most active volcano in the Cascades range. And in some ways, the Cascades have been relatively inactive for the past century or so. The historical average is about 3 eruptions per century. And I guess we've had sort of 2.5. There was Lassen Peak, then there was a big gap before Mount St. Helens. Then Mount St. Helens erupted again between 2004 and 2008. So in some ways, we're at the average. The volcano most likely to erupt is Mount St. Helens. It has erupted the most times in the past few thousands of years. The reason Mount St. Helens is such a beautiful and symmetric volcano is because the entire volcano was really created just in the last 3,000 years from eruptions. So it's sort of been in a state of continuous eruption for a long time. But all of our volcanoes, all of our major volcanoes in Washington State, all 5 of them are active volcanoes. Any one of them could erupt at any time, and it wouldn't surprise me in the least if one of them did. But you never can tell exactly when it's going to be. But anyway, if there were a volcano that was likely to erupt right away, it would be Mount St. Helens again.
Kind of tying into that question, Max asks, thinking about disaster preparedness efforts in the Pacific Northwest currently, what are your biggest fears regarding gauging eruption risk? And in other words, what still hasn't happened for better preparedness yet that should happen?
Well, yeah, I have some slides. If I'd had a little more time, I would have showed some slides of some of the risks that we face. One thing about moving to the Pacific Northwest is I did not, it's a beautiful place, and I really love living here again and writing stories about the Pacific Northwest. But wow, it's kind of a dangerous place too, because it's not just volcanic eruptions. I live in downtown Seattle now in a high rise, and whether this high rise will still be standing after the next big earthquake, and we're certainly going to have one. We will either have the subduction zone earthquakes that happen about every 300 years, 500 years, I guess, is the recurrence interval, but it's been 300 years since the last one, or a major earthquake on the Seattle Fault that runs directly under the city. Well, it remains to be seen if this building will still be standing. And then there are all the other risks that we face as well. We have landslides, we have mudslides. Landslides, when the next big earthquake does happen, there'll be a huge amount of landslides. I look out my window at these incredible scenes in Washington State, the volcanoes on the horizon and the mountains, and just the beautiful geography and setting that we live in, that we can hike in. And really, that setting is a consequence of the tectonic processes that have created those volcanoes. So in some ways, the risks that we put up with living here in the Pacific Northwest are sort of the price that we have to pay for living in such a beautiful part of the country. But yeah, there are lots of risks. There's no doubt about it. And the question was sort of about emergency preparedness. We have a lot of work to do on emergency preparedness. These earthquakes definitely are going to happen. And when they do happen, projections are that thousands of people in the city of Seattle will be killed and many more thousands will be injured. And it will most of our bridges will fall down. It will completely overwhelm whatever healthcare facilities we have. We have a lot of more immediate problems, but just like the people who were around Mount St. Helens that day, we sort of can't take our eyes off the fact that that these risks are out there, and that even low probability events, if you go long enough, are going to happen, as in the case of Mount St. Helens. And we need to devote some time to prepare for them. Does that mean that my earthquake preparedness kit is absolutely perfectly up to date? No, it doesn't. So every time I talk about this, I remind myself that I'd better go get my water in line and make sure that I have enough food for 2 weeks, because I don't have enough of it now.
Honestly, I was just thinking the exact same thing. I was like,
right.
Is mine up to date? I should probably go check after this.
Yes.
I just want to address our audience again. If you guys have any questions you'd like to share, please go ahead and submit them in that Q&A button. If you'd like to share your story as well, and maybe what you remember about that day back in May 1980, please feel free to either just say, I want to share my story in that Q&A button, and we can get you guys on the talk. But again, this is just another call out for if anyone has any questions. And while we're waiting for this to come in, Steve, I was curious, you said you focused in your book on kind of the northwest side of the mountain and the stories there. Were there any stories from individuals that were in a different kind of area during the eruption that you may want to share here?
Oh yeah, there are some amazing stories. So especially the people that were just west of the mountain. So I'm working right now with someone named Francisco Valenzuela, and keep an eye on the Seattle Times, because this Sunday, I think Francisco is going to publish an op-ed about the current management of the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument. He's been observing it for the 42 years. So it was his very first day as a recreation planner for the Forest Service on that Sunday. He was out there examining his territory, and he was up there that Sunday morning with some people who were as close to the volcano as you can get on the west side, maybe just 4 miles away or so. And it's only through a sort of a fluke of the way the topography works on the west side of the mountain that the blast was channeled in one direction and not directly at them. He says it's just a miracle that he managed to survive that day. So there are lots of incredible stories that I wasn't able to tell about people on the west side of the mountain, some of whom were able to escape. And of course, those are the stories we know about, and some of whom weren't. And we would find their cars and their bodies, and in some cases, the photographs that they had snapped in the minute after the volcano erupted and before the eruption reached them. So there's a book called In the Path of Destruction, and it is a wonderful book by a geologist named Richard Waite, and it has the stories of the detailed stories of all of the eyewitnesses to the volcano that day. And sort of recommend reading my book first to get the lay of the land and figure out the overall things of what happened. But if you really want to read all the stories of all the people around the volcano, that book, In the Path of Destruction, I really highly recommend it.
Awesome. I jotted that down, so I'll read your book and then go check that one out as well. We have a few more comments that popped up. Virginia Town, she said she was on Mercer Island that morning reading the newspaper and heard the bang. Police officer on I-90 ran his noise, not knowing the explosion was so far away. Oh, goodness. And then a few other people just thanking you for such a great talk.
I'll tell a little story about the sound. I always, when we do this in person, I do like to hear people whether or not they actually heard the sound of the eruption that morning. The way that people tend to have heard it, I mean, people in Lacey, I would have expected not to have heard it, but it's interesting that she was on Bainbridge Island, because what happened is that the sound, the ash cloud from the eruption muffled the sound of the volcano as it came out laterally, horizontally. But the sound went up in the upper atmosphere and bounced off some layers in the atmosphere and then traveled back down to the earth. And so you could actually hear the volcano if you were far enough away from it. And there's a line that sort of goes through Seattle And people to the north of that line, in some cases all the way to Canada, did hear the volcano. And people south of that line, all the way from Seattle down to the vicinity of the volcano, did not hear anything. It was completely silent. So it's a strange phenomenon. And people's reports about what they heard that morning and where they were really line up with that phenomenon of the sound bouncing off the atmosphere and coming back down.
Wow, I didn't know that happened with eruptions. That ties into our last comment that I see right here from Carol. She said she heard the blast from Bellevue, didn't know what it was until much later, but goodness, that.
Yes, it was the days before cell phones, and even before much, the local news did start covering it later on, but a lot of people just found out over the course of that Sunday. You know, I'll just say one last thing, which is that many people in Southwest Washington consider it an incredible miracle that the volcano erupted on a Sunday, because if it had erupted on a weekday, when those hundreds of Weyerhaeuser loggers were working around the volcano, hundreds, really truly hundreds of people would have died because of the eruption. And there are still people in Southwest Washington. I mean, I talked to them throughout the course of writing this book who said, yeah, if it had erupted on a Monday or a Tuesday at that same time, I wouldn't be here.
Wow, that's powerful. Again, audience, if you guys have any questions or comments, please feel free to add them into that Q&A section. And while we wait to see if those come in, I just had one more question for you, Steve. I always like to ask any authors that we have in our history talks if there is a current project or book you're working on currently that you'd like to share with the audience.
Yeah, you know, I'm not. I wrote that book about the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, and that too is an incredible story. I mean, to some extent, what happened at Hanford is way more important in world history than is the eruption of Mount St. Helens. The creation of plutonium for the very first atomic explosion that ever occurred and for the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki is an amazing part of Washington state history that not many people know. And if they have a chance to go and visit the B reactor at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, which has been preserved, it's the very first large-scale nuclear reactor built anywhere in the world, I highly recommend it. It is another astonishing story of something that happened right here in our backyards that we don't know much about. You know, but no, am I writing on something right now? No, you know, somebody told me this week that nobody has ever written a book on the Oso landslide. And I said to myself, boy, that would really be a pretty darn interesting book. But I sort of have to think about it because I've sort of been there with this book. I don't know if I want to spend another 2 or 3 years writing about these immense natural disasters and the trauma that they cause the people in the surrounding area who knew people that were killed in the disaster. So I don't know if I'm going to get to the Oso landslide, but it is astonishing that no major book has ever been written about that.
That is surprising. Well, maybe in the future you may change your mind and have a new book out there.
Exactly. If I have a little more time to think about it, maybe I'll do that.
But I believe those are all of the questions we have. Steve, thank you so much for joining us tonight for our history talk. Audience, thank you all so much for joining us. Again, we are going to be taking a hiatus for the summer, so we won't have any history talks until September. But make sure you keep checking lacemuseum.org for the most up-to-date information about programs and our history talks. But Steve, thank you again so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Carson. It was my pleasure.